My name is Dan. I run a 1,200-acre farm in rural Nebraska. I never thought much about monsters, not the kind kids whisper about at sleepovers, not the ones in old movies, not the type that supposedly roam the woods in late-night radio stories. I'd lived my whole life in eastern Nebraska, surrounded by corn, cattle, and folks who minded their own business. Out here, the closest thing to a monster was a black bear getting bold around calving season. I'm a farmer, not a storyteller. I fix fences, drive tractors, and worry about weather forecasts, not folklore. So when my phone buzzed late that morning, and John Carter's name lit up the screen, the last thing I expected was fear in his voice. John wasn't the kind of man who rattled easily. He'd served in the Marines back in his 20s and still carried himself like a man who didn't have room for panic. Steady, solid, level-headed. If you told me anyone in the county had stared down something strange in the dark, John would have been the last person on my list. But the moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. "Hey," I said, "what's going on?" His voice came back low, tight, like he was holding something inside. "I need you to come out to my place, right now, and bring your rifle." That alone was enough to make my stomach knot. "Why? What happened?" "Something tried to break in last night," he said. Some animal. Big one. Almost killed me. I shot it 4 times, but it got away." I frowned and stepped onto my porch, staring out toward the gray morning. Storm clouds still clogged half the sky from last night's downpour. "You mean a bear?" "It wasn't a bear, just... Come here. Please, I need a couple of guys to go after that thing. I'll explain everything." John Carter wasn't the type to make things up. If he said that something was out there, then something was out there. And if one of us farmers needs a hand, we don't ask questions. So I grabbed my keys, my hunting rifle, and the old .357 revolver I kept in the gun safe but seldom used. I had no idea what I was driving into, but the tightness in John's voice told me it wasn't going to be a walk in the park. Truth be told, I didn't believe anything supernatural was waiting for me out there. I figured maybe some desperate drifter on meth had gone manic in the storm, or perhaps a big feral dog with rabies had shown up on his porch. But something powerful enough to break into a house and walk away with 4 gunshot wounds? I had no idea what to expect. I just knew that I had to step up. About 10 minutes later, I pulled into John's long driveway. His and his wife Beth's house sat at the end of a long dirt road, about a mile from the nearest road, surrounded by cornfields. John was already waiting out front, his rifle slung over his shoulder and a 9mm holstered at his hip. His face looked drawn, like he'd barely slept. Another truck rolled up behind me. Eli stepped out, our neighbor Earl's son. Early 20s, a good kid, enthusiastic but green. He managed a few hundred acres that his dad owned, but could no longer work due to dementia. The kid worked harder than any of us, was always itching for anything that felt like an adventure. He carried a Ruger American hunting rifle. "Glad you came," John said, shaking my hand. His grip was steady, but his eyes weren't. "Tell me what happened," I said. He exhaled slowly. "During the storm last night, some dude showed up and mumbled about a large animal that had attacked him. Next thing I knew, something started slamming into my back door. Hard. Almost broke through. I thought it was a man at first. I grabbed the shotgun and fired through the door twice. Heard it scream. Any normal animal would have bolted after that. But this thing, it hit the bedroom window next, smashed it in and came inside. Beth fired the pistol at it. That finally drove it off. I went after the thing and put another 2 rounds of .30-06 in it. Again, it managed to get away. Dragged itself into the cornfield over there." He pointed over his shoulder towards the back of the house. "Bastard is still out there. I'm telling you, that thing, whatever it is unlike anything I've ever seen. It stood upright like a man, but the shape of it was all wrong. Too broad in the shoulders, too long in the arms, built for strength no normal person should have. And its face, it looked a bit like a wolf, but twice the size, like something nature never meant to put on a 2-legged being." He shook his head as he described the creature. I didn't know what to say. A wolf man? Seriously? The word alone sounded ridiculous. Something out of a campfire story told by drunk teenagers. But then again, it was John. The guy was straight as an arrow. No booze, no drugs, no bullshit. If he said he saw something standing upright with a face like that, then whatever he'd seen was real, even if I had no name for it. And maybe that was the part that unsettled me the most, the idea that something like that could exist out here in the fields and woods. If John was right, then we had every reason to go after it and finish it off. At least we weren't alone in this. 3 guys with rifles are no army, but enough to watch each other's back, and certainly enough to take down a damn animal. We walked behind the house. The back door looked like a damn bulldozer had attacked it. Deep, splintered gouges carved across the frame, wide enough for my thumb to fit in, long enough to run almost the full height of the door. When I leaned in closer, tracing the spacing with my eyes, a cold pressure crawled down my throat. Whatever made those marks had paws almost as big as dinner plates. The lock plate had been nearly bent loose. Judging by what I saw, that thing must have been the size of a fully grown bear, at least. John pointed to the ground, where faint but unmistakable impressions marked the mud, human-shaped footprints, but far too large. I crouched and studied them, running my hand just above the surface without touching. The stride was long, the weight spread wide across the forefoot, and the depth. The depth alone meant whatever made them was carrying far more weight than any man or dog I'd ever known. And the way the toes splayed, digging in like it needed traction, it looked more like a drunk trying to balance on 2 legs than any animal I knew of. As crazy as it sounded, the Wolfman theory didn't seem quite so far-fetched anymore. Then I saw the window John had mentioned. Glass inside the house, glass outside, and the same deep gouges in the siding. I didn't know what had come through here, but it sure as hell wasn't anything I wanted to come across alone in the dark. "Tracks go this way," John said, pointing toward the cornfield to the west. Eli and I followed him to the edge of the crop. The ground was muddy and churned up badly, like something huge had fallen over and rolled around or dragged itself away. The trail led into the crop. I swallowed hard. If we were really going after this thing, then we had to follow it into the corn. It was a good season, and the crop was dense and stood 10 to 12 feet tall. It was the perfect hiding spot for a large predator. I looked at Eli and John. John looked unshakable, but Eli didn't. I could see that the claw marks had rattled him. His hands weren't shaking exactly, but there was a tightness in the way he gripped his rifle that made my stomach twist. I hoped to God he could keep it together. We needed a 3rd man if we were going to take on something as dangerous as that thing. John cleared his throat and lowered his voice a little, like he didn't want the cornfield itself to hear him. "It's wounded," he said. "With the hits it took last night, it might have even bled out somewhere in this field. But we have to be sure. We can't let that thing run around the county. It tried to kill my wife and me. It might hurt someone else." He checked over his rifle, then glanced between me and Eli. "We follow the trail, we stay close together, and we keep our rifles up. If it's alive, we put it out of its misery. Then we hand it over to the sheriff and let him decide what the hell to do with it." The ground was soft from last night's rain, which helped, though it also meant any blood would have washed away. What remained were broken stalks, irregular footprints, and the odd drag mark visible in the mud. The rain actually made it easier to track this thing. "It was hit in the legs," John said. "Its gait is uneven. It seems to be having trouble walking. Has fallen over more than a few times." Eli hovered behind us. "If it's hurt that bad, then this should be easy, right?" he asked. "Maybe," John said. "But hurt doesn't mean harmless. I've seen what this thing can do, trust me. You don't want to be caught off guard by it. If it gets the jump on you, you'll be done for. No doubt about that." The tracks moved west, toward the creek, weaving, staggering. The fresh rainwater shimmered in the depressions. The creek on the other end of that field marked the border of John's property. It had come all the way up during the storm and was now more like a medium-sized river, about 30 feet wide and maybe 20 deep. The footprints led straight into the water and stopped cold. We couldn't make out any prints coming out on either side, and we couldn't just cross over. John crouched beside the muddy bank, scanning the reeds and the swirling brown current. "It must have gone in," he muttered. "Probably got carried a ways before it crawled back out somewhere downstream. In its condition, and with the water this high, it wouldn't have been able to swim upstream." John rose, tightening his grip on the rifle. Let's head down along the bank. Stay close. If it climbed out anywhere nearby, we'll see the marks. And if it didn't, then God help whoever's land it came out onto. A few hundred yards downstream, we finally spotted fresh impressions leading out of the water. Deep footprints and long drag marks tearing through the mud toward an old culvert that tunneled beneath a gravel service road. We followed the tracks in silence. Everyone was on edge. Hell, even I could feel my pulse in my teeth. But Eli looked the worst. He kept glancing over his shoulder, gripping his rifle so tight his knuckles had gone bone white. The kid had the look of someone barely able to hold himself together. I hoped he wouldn't freeze up when push came to shove. Every gun mattered if we were going to corner something as dangerous as this. When we approached the culvert, a horrible stench hit us. Rot, carrion, and something wet and sour beneath it. The smell made all three of us gag. God almighty, I muttered, covering my nose. John didn't waver. He took a look inside, but couldn't make out anything in the darkness. Nobody had brought a flashlight, so John shouldered his rifle and pulled out his phone. He flicked on the torch, holding it high in his left hand, while his right hand pulled out the 9mm from its holster. I also shouldered my rifle and pulled out my .357 revolver, preferring something I could bring up fast in close quarters. John pulled his t-shirt over his nose, then took the lead and went in. I followed. Eli stayed at the entrance, eyes darting around the corn and the road above us. The kid looked rattled, but he stood his ground, rifle ready, face pale, looking and listening for anything out of the ordinary. About 20 feet in, John's phone light washed over the source of the stench. A mound of bones and half-rotted carcasses sprawled across the culvert floor. Rats, foxes, a couple of chickens, a deer reduced to ribs and hide, and something that looked like a German shepherd, red collar still attached. Every one of them mangled, torn open, partially eaten, the meat sloughed off in places by rot and in others by teeth. It was a terrible sight. I gagged and put my forearm over my mouth. John just stared, jaw tight, sweeping the phone torch over the grisly heap. On the far side of it, something pale caught my eye. A skull, human, stripped clean of flesh and skin, ragged in places where teeth had met bone. Some of the edges were fractured, crushed inward, as if something powerful had bitten straight through. A chill went through me. Dead animals were one thing, but human remains, that meant the thing we were after had fed on human flesh. For the first time in my adult life, I was scared, really scared, and I started asking myself whether this really was a good idea. Maybe it was better to report this to the authorities and let them deal with it, but I didn't say anything. I knew John wouldn't stop. If I pulled out, he'd keep going by himself, and if he got himself killed, I would never be able to forgive myself. John didn't say a word, didn't flinch, didn't react. He lowered the phone a fraction and stared at the skull the way a man stares at an answer he already suspected, but didn't want confirmed. Then a sound drifted through the wind and corn, thin, quavering, almost swallowed by the breeze. A faint cry. Help! For a moment, none of us moved. The culvert amplified the echo, making it impossible to tell how far away it had come from. But Eli reacted instantly. "Somebody's out here!" he shouted, voice cracking with something between hope and panic. "Eli, wait!" I barked, but he was already gone. I rushed out, John following close behind. When I stepped out into the light, I could see Eli entering the cornfield on the other side of the gravel road. I yelled after him, but he either didn't hear me or didn't care. Within seconds, the corn had swallowed him completely. John and I rushed after him. We entered the crop and called his name. "Here!" he yelled back. That didn't help much, though. His voice sounded like he was at least 50 yards away. I couldn't even guess in which direction. The next thing we heard was a scream, then another one. Sharp, panicked cries that tore through the rows. A heartbeat after that. They were followed by 2 gunshots. Another scream came right after, more desperate this time, raw with pain. The kind of sound that stops your heart cold. The screams gave us at least some idea of where Eli was. John and I didn't waste any time. We ran into the corn, guns in hand. Within moments, we began hearing him again, moaning, sobbing, the kind of broken sounds a man makes when he's hurt and scared to death. We pushed through row after row until the corn finally opened into a small, trampled clearing. There he was, sitting in the mud, hunched over, clutching his left arm. The area around him looked like a war zone. Stalks were snapped at every angle. The dirt churned up as if something huge had slammed him down and dragged him. Eli's shirt hung in ribbons, soaked through with blood. Deep gouges carved across his left arm and chest. Long, straight, unmistakably claw marks. When he saw us, he could no longer keep it together. He dropped his rifle into the mud and started crying full on. Eli tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. It talked, he sobbed. Not like a person, but it tried. It said help, just like that. I thought someone was hurt. I thought... His voice cracked, and he clutched his bleeding arm tighter. It wasn't human. That thing was waiting for me. It mimicked a voice, it lured me in, it knew exactly what it was doing. He shook his head violently, eyes wide with terror, snot mixing with tears. I swear to God, Dan, this thing, it wanted me alone. If you two hadn't shown up, I'd be dead. There was a clear trail through the corn where the attack had happened. Broken stalks, torn leaves, and churned up mud showing exactly which way the creature had gone after Eli shot it. But John and I didn't follow it. Eli needed help. I hauled him up, slinging his good arm over my shoulders, and half-walked, half-carried him back through the corn and across the gravel road, all the way to John's place. John took the rear to ensure we made it in one piece. Beth started sobbing when she saw Eli, but she kept it together. She took him to the hospital in town while John and I discussed what to do next. Should we call the sheriff? I asked. John shook his head immediately. Hell no. He's an idiot. He'll either shrug it off or march a couple of deputies out here and get them all killed. This is our mess to deal with. We have to finish it ourselves. I didn't like it, but he wasn't wrong, and I didn't want anyone else getting torn up like Eli. We agreed to head out again the next morning. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the human skull in that culvert. I heard Eli's screams. I smelled the rot. Something terrible was out there. Something that had no business being loose in our backyard. And in just a few hours, John and I were going back into those fields to look for it again. Beth called just after sunup while I was nursing bad coffee in John's kitchen. Eli was out of surgery, stitched, stapled, pumped full of antibiotics and painkillers. The doctor said he'd live, hurt, but stable. Hearing it out loud took a brick off my chest, but it didn't make what came next any easier. We headed out with our rifles and sidearms, just the two of us this time. Back at the attack site, the ground told us the thing had been back there some time during the night. Fresh impressions cut through the damp soil, every step more crooked than the last. The tracks didn't flow, they lurched. One leg was getting dragged hard, the other had suffered at least some damage, and the whole gait looked broken and unstable. Footprints punched deep and at odd angles, like the weight shifted under it the wrong way. There were tiny stains of blood on leaves here and there, and the trail was pretty obvious. I started adding up what we knew. 1 or 2 hits with a shotgun through the back door 2 nights earlier. Beth's pistol shot in the hallway. 2 rifle rounds from John when it fled the house. Eli's rifle round in the corn. And the screwdriver wound Kevin had planted under its left eye. At least 5 bullets and 1 stab. But that thing was still walking because none of us had landed a clean, lethal hit, and it still clearly had some fight left in it. The trail sloped back toward the creek again, cutting a tired line through the corn. We followed it to the bank, and sure enough, the prints led straight into the water, leaving us with no clear trail to follow. But that didn't stop us. There was no way that thing could swim against the current in its state, and with that much water in the creek. John took a few moments to sort through his thoughts, then suddenly pointed downstream. "Half a mile that way," he said. "There's an old farmhouse right on the water. Been empty for decades. Nobody goes out there. If this thing has any sense, and it does, it'll hole up somewhere safe and dry, where people won't stumble into it." I knew the place he meant. Roof half caved, porch leaning, cottonwoods crowding the yard. A forgotten house by a swollen creek. Private, quiet, far enough away from civilization. If the creature was thinking even remotely like a person, it would want some sort of shelter, somewhere to lie down, rest, and heal. "Let's check it out," I said. It was just a hunch, but we didn't have anything better to go on at that moment. John nodded and took the lead. We cut downstream through wet grass and low brush, eyes constantly scanning the corn on both sides of the creek. We knew this thing was an ambush predator. The attack on Eli had proved that. If we slipped up even a little, it would be on us in no time. The old farmhouse was a mess. It was the kind of place folks still mentioned in low voices. The old Riley place, abandoned in the 60s after a spring flood took their little boy, and the bank finished the job a year later. From a distance, you could mistake it for a dark shape of cottonwoods until the lines resolved into a sagging roofline and a broken porch tilted down toward the water. The closer we got, the worse it looked, siding cupping and flaking from sun and frost, windows blown out and filmed with grime, porch boards warped and split like old ribs. A curtain moved in an upstairs window, but when I blinked, I realized it was just wind and torn fabric. We stopped 20 yards out and watched. Nothing moved that wasn't supposed to. No shadow in a doorway, no shift of weight on a floorboard, no glint of eyes. "Let's go in," John said softly. "Get your revolver and torch out." This time, we were better prepared. After the culvert the day before, we both decided to bring real torches. I shouldered my rifle and drew the .357, feeling the old familiar weight settle into my hand. John unholstered his 9mm. We came up the skewed porch steps side by side. The front door was canted in its frame. The latch had long since fallen out. John nudged it with his boot, and it drifted inward, sighing on broken hinges. The smell hit us immediately. Dust, old wet wood, and under that something metallic and sour that had nothing to do with weather. Rot. The same kind of rot we had smelled in that damn culvert. We were definitely on the right track. We paused inside the living room to let our eyes adjust. An old, mold-ridden couch lay on its back like a dead animal, springs hooked out like ribs. A first-generation TV sat face up against a wall, its glass shattered. In one corner, something had dragged a chair until it ground grooves into the floor and stopped it there. "Let's do a full sweep," John whispered. We moved along opposite walls, guns up, breathing as quietly as possible. Each doorway we came across made my pulse go wild. The kitchen was a disaster of overturned drawers and rusted tins. A pot lay on its side, full of mummified leaves and rat droppings. On the linoleum near the sink, a pink women's sneaker sat by itself, the plastic lace clip shaped like a butterfly. That shoe definitely wasn't from the 60s. It looked pretty new. We shared a glance, both of us understanding the implications. I swallowed and kept moving towards the bathroom. The walls in the hallway that led from the main living area to the back of the house were lined with sets of deep, parallel gouges, claw marks, 4 lines each, spaced about 2 inches apart, with a 5th line about 4 inches out, 4 fingers and a thumb. I held my own hand up against it for comparison. The hand that made these claw marks was almost 1.5 times the size of mine. This thing was big. If its body proportions were similar to those of a man, it was probably 7 feet tall at the very least. Something of that size, combining the intelligence of a man with the ferocity of a wolf. Let's just say it took a few seconds for me to gather the courage to push forward. John was right behind me when I nudged the bathroom door open. I really wish I had let him take the lead on that one. The bathroom was something else entirely. The clawfoot tub was heaped with gnawed bones, and on top of the pile lay a fresh raccoon and a half-eaten cat. Fur slick, bellies opened, flies already gathering in the damp. But there was more. Larger bones near the bottom of the pile. Human bones. Taking a few steps closer, I could make out some type of red fabric beneath all the bones. It took me a bit to make sense of it, but my head finally pieced it together. I was looking at the remains of a tank top. Beneath it, I could make out a strip of denim. I needed a moment to process it all. John nudged me and pointed to the far corner of the room. Underneath the sink, buried under more bones, sat the second sneaker, the match to the pink one we'd found in the kitchen. John shook his head. "I remember a report in the newspaper about a missing woman. maybe a year ago or so," he said quietly. "People figured she ran off with her boyfriend. He was never seen again either." The room felt smaller as it sank in. She hadn't run. She'd ended up here, torn apart and fed on by this, whatever it was that had made this place home. We circled back to the living room to take a look at the other side of the house. A dining room opened under a buckling plaster ceiling. We hadn't been in there on our first pass, as we feared that the creature might ambush us from the back of the house. That's why we didn't see the signs earlier. Minor stains on the wooden floorboards. Blood. They led to a short hallway at the far end of the dining room. There was another door leading outside, this one firmly shut. And opposite that door was another, half open. We didn't see it when we walked past there before, because it was hidden around a corner. The stains led directly to it. John nudged it open with his gun, and I looked over his shoulder. A narrow stairwell yawned downward into total darkness. The smell that came out of there was unbearable, much worse than both the culvert and the bathroom. This was the smell of rot, confined sweat, and meat, turned over and over in old, stagnant air. I pulled my shirt over my nose without thinking. John didn't bother. He just narrowed his eyes and brought his flashlight up. He nudged the door fully open. The hinges whispered and then went quiet. "Stairs are steep," he said. "Watch your footing." John began to descend, slowly and cautiously, gun raised in his right hand, torch in his left. I stayed about 3 steps behind. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a low, dirt-floored cellar. John swept his light across the room. Several heaps of bones and rubbish were centered around a massive nest. I don't really know what to call it. It was made up of blankets, clothes, cardboard, and what looked like an old mattress. Everything was covered in dust and mold. It was disgusting. We moved forward another step, then another, breathing through our shirts. That sour metal taste sat on the back of my tongue and wouldn't leave. John kept the light on the nest. I kept my revolver trained on the shadows beyond it, where a gap between 2 columns opened into a lower pocket of the cellar. Then the world exploded. Something hit me from behind with enormous force. My feet left the ground, and I slammed shoulder first into the opposite wall hard enough to almost knock me out entirely. White flashed across my vision. My ears went to wool. For a few seconds, I didn't know which way was up. Gunfire detonated in that box of a room, 2, 3 shots, and the blasts blew the hearing clean out of my head. The world collapsed to white noise and a hard, needling ring. Everything else came thin and far away. Under the ringing, I caught a low, wet rumble, more felt than heard, like a growl rising from the floor. Something big scrambled in the middle of the room, and a shape, John, made a sound I barely registered, a breathy bark cut off by a scream that somehow reached my one remaining eardrum. My sight came back in a strobe of light and dark, the broad cone of John's torch arcing across the room, the muzzle flash painting the walls orange, the light dropping, flaring, dying again. 2 figures slammed into each other, and apart in the center of the cellar, one on 2 legs, then on all 4s, the other knocked sideways into a wall. I dragged myself to one knee and tried to understand what I was seeing. The beam steadied just long enough to show John crumpled on his side against the wall, one arm tucked under him, the other clutched to his chest. He was gasping, eyes wild but awake. In the middle of the room, the thing that had hit me lay half-sprawled on its stomach, hauling itself toward my friend an inch at a time, a hitch in its hips like the joints were nailed together wrong. The torch was on the dirt between us, tipped sideways. Its light ran low along the floor and threw everything into a mean, crawling half-glow. Even stunned, I could see it. I could not mistake it. A head like a wolf's but too big, muzzle cracked and wet, yellow canines bare past black gums, ears torn and laid back, breath dragging heavily through a chest that had more than one hole in it. At first glance, the body looked human. A barrel, bare chest flanked by patchy fur, shoulders knotted like rope, arms just a little too long and ending in hands with fingers that had claws longer than my own fingers. The legs were wrong twice over, long, bent backwards and chewed by several bullets. One had a neat frozen tremor where the muscle wouldn't answer anymore. The whole thing stank of cellar rot, sweat, and wet dog. John was alive. I could see him shivering, and his eyes were locked on the monstrosity crawling towards him. He must have lost both his rifle and his pistol as his hands were empty. The creature, the wolfman, dragged itself toward him with a patient, hateful determination, one claw biting into the dirt, then the next. I had to do something. My own hands were empty, and I started looking around for my revolver. The impact must have knocked the rifle clean off my shoulder. I had no idea where it was and couldn't see it. I pawed at the floor to my right and felt cold steel. The revolver lay half buried in the rubbish, about 2 feet from my knee. I grabbed it, rolled onto my hip, and brought it up. "Hey," I heard myself say, voice raw and small in all that noise. The wolfman turned its head toward me, clearly surprised. I didn't wait. I pulled the trigger, and I didn't stop. The first round hit it straight between the eyes. The second took it in the cheek. The third and fourth drew in into its upper chest. I have no idea where the last 2 hit, since it was already jerking around wildly by then, but I am confident that all 6 rounds found their mark. The creature was lying on its back, the lower half of its body weirdly twisted. It was still twitching, but the jerking and growling had stopped. John was up before I knew it. One hand was clutching a wound just above his stomach, while the other had somehow found his pistol. He didn't take any chances. He put his entire clip into the thing's already mangled head. The monster was dead, no doubt about that. The ringing in my ears made the world feel far away. I pushed myself upright and staggered over to John. He had one hand clamped over a slice just above his belt, where claws had raked across and caught flesh, but he stood firmly on his own 2 feet. Blood soaked the fabric of his shirt, but it wasn't pumping. He saw me looking and tried a thin smile that didn't take. Between ragged breaths, John muttered that the bastard had played us from start to finish. It hadn't been holed up in the house at all. It had waited somewhere outside, listening, and slipped in after we backed ourselves into the cellar. "Smart son of a bitch," he rasped, eyes hard. "Left those bloodstains on purpose to lead us down here. Wanted us boxed in and distracted so it could jump us from behind." The thought made my skin crawl. What a damn smart abomination that thing was. I got John's arm over my shoulder and helped him up the stairs. Every step was a prayer that the treads would hold and that nothing else was waiting at the top. When we got back to his place about an hour later, he waved off my offer to take him to town and shook his head when I tried to take his keys. "I can drive," he insisted. The man wouldn't budge. I didn't like it, but arguing was a waste of time. "What do we do with the body?" I asked. "Nothing. You grab a couple of gas cans from my shed. Go back. Burn it down. All of it. Body, bones, nest, the whole damn house. Nothing good comes from bringing more people in. Sheriff wouldn't know what to do with it. Next thing, we'd have the feds up our asses." I frowned. "What about the remains? The missing woman?" He held my stare for a long beat. "Nothing's gonna bring her back. Knowing what happened to her won't make it any easier for the family. Best to end this whole thing right here." I stood there a long minute, hands on my knees, breathing hard and trying to think. John was right, so I went and got the jerry cans. When I got back to the old house, I took the first can down into the cellar. I found the wolfman exactly as we'd left it, sprawled on its back on the floor, head ruined, chest collapsed, and still. I tried not to look too closely when I emptied the gas can on it, as I knew that these images were going to haunt me for the rest of my life. I wanted no part of that thing, whatever it was, wherever it came from. I wanted to get the job done as quickly as possible, and then get the hell away from it. When I was done, I lit a match and threw it, then hauled my butt up the stairs. Then I emptied the remaining 3 cans and lit everything up. The whole house was going up in flames within minutes. Then I watched it collapse, burying the thing in the cellar under a dozen tons of smoking debris. John and Eli both made a full recovery. Eli took his run-in with that thing harder than any of us expected. He couldn't work the farm after that, and his father sold it. They moved to the city and lived off the proceeds. I'm still farming, but I haven't found a clean way to put it behind me. John and I are still friends. We help each other around our properties, but we don't talk about the wolfman. Ever. And no one ever asked questions about the old house, just as John predicted.